Welcome to The Art of the Cut, an interview series with the world's top editors. I'm your host, Steve Hullfish, ACE. Today, editor Paul Hirsch, ACE, discusses his storied career, cutting such films as Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, Carrie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol. We'll also discuss Paul's memoir, A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room Far, Far Away.
Your book, I pre-ordered it long before it was available because I was so excited to read it, and there's so many great stories in it. There's also great nuggets of things that you can learn as an editor, and I wanted to explore some of those ideas with you. One of them is on your very first film, you had the realization that you felt like each scene had been edited well, but that doesn't mean that the movie is edited well.
Right.
Can you expand on that? Like, how is that possible that each scene is great, but the movie isn't?
It's a very important lesson to learn, because what you are presenting to an audience is a total experience. And to understand what you're presenting to them, you have to watch the whole thing. If we had watched the whole thing without the presence of the producer, which was another big mistake that we made, inviting Marty Ransohoff to watch the film with us, we would have discovered that it was way too long. And, you know, a movie, in a way, is sort of like a meal. You know, no matter how good the food is, at some point you get full. You know, and you sort of, well, okay, had enough. The interesting part of it for me is finding the proper length for that story. In other words, a picture has to find its own length. Mm-hmm. The story has to flow naturally. You don't want it to go too fast. You don't want to go too slow. You don't want it to be over long. You don't want it to be confusing. You don't want it to be boring. All those things. Cutting the film, that's your intention, is to find the length that satisfies all those requirements. And sometimes it's an hour 52. Sometimes it's 2:03. You know, whatever it is, the picture has found its own length.
We're talking about the whole movie, the pace of the whole movie and the length of the whole movie.
Right.
And one of your other experiences, which I thought was just for pure number of minutes is exceptional, is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
Yeah.
Tell me about the first cut compared to the final that we all know and love.
Planes, Trains, and Automobiles was the longest first cut I had ever had. And it's still, to this day, it's the longest first cut that I ever was involved with. And the cut ran 3 hours and 45 minutes. The script was overlong, and John knew it, but he wouldn't cut it down, and he wouldn't let anyone else cut it down. And his approach was to shoot the script as he'd written it. He never rewrote his scripts. They were sort of given to him by the muse in their entirety, and they sort of poured through him. He wrote the first 60 pages of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles in one sitting at night. He came into the mix of Ferris Bueller and he handed me 60 pages. I said, "What's this?" He said, "It's the next movie I'm doing." And it was the first 60 pages of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And he would write as fast as he could type. But anyway, his method was he would shoot the script that he'd written and then he would cut it. Then he was, in the editing room, he was ruthless. The one was on paper and easy to make the cuts, he wouldn't do it. So what happened was, the picture, as it turned out, ran 90 minutes, the final version. And they shot for 85 days. And there were days when we had 2 or 3 hours of dailies. I remember coming out of dailies one day and saying to my crew, "We just watched more film for this one scene than the whole picture can run." And they shot 85 days. So
a lot of cutting, a lot of dailies.
A lot of dailies, and it was on film. There was no way to easily search for line readings, because John would set up a close-up, and he'd get through the scene. He'd say, "All right, let's take it again from the top." And there would be no slate or anything, no indication that he was resetting. So he would just go again, and then he'd say, "Okay, take it from the line where, you know," so like, and then eventually the assistant cameraman would yell out, "Run out, reload," and he never said cut. So we have, 3,000 feet of John Candy doing lines from a scene, but no indication of, you have to watch and listen to it to find the line readings to begin to compare them. So it was incredibly time-consuming and challenging. So eventually we had 4 editors working, and when we finished the first cut, it was a week after the end of production, which is phenomenal. And we set up a screening at 10 a.m. We watched 12 reels. We broke and had lunch. And then we watched another 12 reels after lunch. And John said to me, he turned to me, he said, "It's too long."
Really?
So, so then we started cutting, and then he and I sat down, and he had actually, he'd obviously given it some thought because there were some subplots. He said, "Well, first of all, let's lose all the stuff about this," So we'd go through the reels. He said, "Take that out, take it out." Right now, yeah, take it out. So I would just take it out. We went through the whole picture that way, and from 3 hours and 45 minutes on the first pass, without even trying to recut anything, just pulling stuff out, we got it down to 2.5 hours.
Wow.
I said, so I turned to him and I said,
But that's the easy stuff too, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, there were pitfalls in that, but the point is, I turned to him, I said, "John, do you realize we just cut 28 days of shooting?" And he went,
what can you do?
"What can you do?"
Luckily, there wasn't a studio head around to hear the comment.
Well, they were all, they knew what they were getting into. They knew this was his method.
The first time we spoke, you asked me to watch 5 movies, and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles was one of those movies. And we talked about one of the things that you cut out was this subplot about the wife thinking he was having an affair.
Yes.
And there's still, if you watch that movie, you can still see expressions on her face or something like that where you're like, what's going on? Because you don't know that she thinks he's having an affair.
Yeah, well, if you watch the ending, when he says, "Honey, this is Del Griffith," and she has a look on her face like, "Oh my God, he wasn't lying to me all this time." But you don't know that because we took it all out. So.
Yeah.
But it's there, yeah, you can see strains of, it's funny, we worked so intensively on getting the cut right. We had a 2-hour cut in the beginning of September, and we were booked into theaters in November. So we were mixing in October, and now it's the beginning of September, and we have a 2-hour movie, and people are walking out. So,
you're in a screening that they're not connecting with the movie at all.
I was blindsided. I had never expected that kind of reaction. I thought this was, we had started at 3 hours and 45 minutes, and we got it down to 2 hours. I thought, this is the funniest movie ever made. And then people were walking out, and I was, thunderstruck is too weak a word.
Does that stay with you as you go into future screenings of other movies?
No, I never recovered. I never recovered from that. Whenever I go into a preview, from then on, whenever I went into a preview, I was always nervous because I didn't know exactly what to expect. Well, John started from writing. He was a writer, and he would generate material the day of or the day before. So you'd find yourself getting dailies for scenes that were much longer than what was in the script. So I don't know, I wasn't around, I was busy cutting, but he was either writing the night before or he was on the set saying, "Do this, do that, I have some new lines for you," whatever. Yeah, he was a phenomenal, he was a genius, a mad genius. So I feel really fortunate to have been able to work on those 2 pictures with him because they're, apart from the Star Wars films, those are the pictures that I hear from people most about.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a Chicagoan. My gosh, what a great film.
Yeah, he loved Chicago. It was sort of a love letter to the city.
You pointed out in your book, the train scene, I think, where it was like, let's look at Steve Martin in a wide shot and a slightly tighter shot and another slightly tighter shot. But then you work with Brian De Palma, and you said in the book, he doesn't really even shoot coverage.
No.
So when you talk, first of all, talk to me about how he what kind of footage you're getting, that there's no coverage, and also what it was like to step away from a director who doesn't shoot coverage, and now you're working on these other films where there's all this coverage, and you're like, what do I do with this? I don't know.
Yeah, well, coverage, in my understanding, is the conventional, there's a master shot, and then there might be, say you're in a restaurant. So there's a master shot, and then there's a side two-shot, 50-50, and then there's a medium shot of each character, and then close-ups. That's coverage. Brian is an extremely brilliant man and has a great visual imagination, and he feels it's beneath his abilities to shoot a scene so conventionally. He, like other, Herb Ross was the same way. He had a visual concept for the scene and would shoot it that way, that didn't involve the conventional way of shooting. Herbert had been a choreographer, and he was very astute about how to place people in the frame and how to move people around, and he had a great visual sense in terms of the decorative aspects of filmmaking, and didn't move the camera, as much as Brian. Brian was all about moving the camera and creating sort of jigsaw puzzles out of complicated camera moves that you sort of have to figure out how to put them all together. So you'd have these set pieces that were he would storyboard them, but his storyboards were a little indecipherable for anyone but him. But nobody moves the camera better than Brian, and his visual storytelling is formidable. I read a quote from Francis Coppola recently. He said that, of all the guys who started out around that time, Brian was the real genius.
Wow.
Because he thought so unconventionally and so visually about things.
But it's interesting that you basically started your career with him.
That was chance.
That was chance, but it's also a very unique way to start your editing career, and then to have to switch to other directors that don't do it the same way. You're used to kind of that first, it's like that first love, I guess, like,
yeah, well, he didn't come out of the box that way. He worked his way up to that.
Yeah.
The earlier films, he was still, developing his art, and by the time we got to Carrie, then it was full blown. But a lot of his approach, a lot of Brian's approach to filming is using the point of view shot. So his goal was what he called pure cinema, where you could understand the characters without any dialogue. And his preferred method of doing that was the point of view shot. So it was, that famous Russian experiment where you have a blank expression on an actor. And
the Kuleshov effect. The Kuleshov effect, I think.
That's the one. You intercut it with a baby, he looks tender. You intercut it with a loaf of bread, he looks hungry. You intercut it with a fire, he looks frightened. So context is everything, and that's the lesson there. And Brian would shoot scenes where you see the actor, and the actor would look at something, and you cut to what he sees, and you cut back, and you would infer what he's feeling, thinking, or whatever, based on how he reacts to what he sees. So that was the underpinning of a lot of what he did.
You mentioned in your book something that you learned was the importance of first impressions. Can you expand on that? Is that something that you, when you're watching dailies, hey, once I watched this 1,000 times, I'm not going to remember the way I first felt about this turn of the head or this glint in the eye, or is it something different?
I think my thinking changed over the years about that, because the technology changed. And the change in technology, I like to say that editing is not about the tools. Writing is not about the pen. It's about the writing. It doesn't matter so much what you use. When I started working on computers, I realized that this problem I was talking about with planes, trains, and automobiles, and being able to compare line readings for that, the computer is a fantastic tool. So you could have an assembly of all the line readings of a given line, right, stacked right next, one next to the other, and be able to give careful consideration to each reading. That's a huge advantage. Then what that meant was that watching it in dailies wasn't so important anymore, because when you see it in dailies, you're looking at the wrong things. You're not thinking of the context, or not necessarily thinking of the context, or you're seeing it in a different context. Sometimes you repurpose a scene for something else, you know. So having that ability to compare line readings later made it less important to make the crucial choice that it used to be, you know, on first seeing the dailies. Now, when I worked with Jonathan Lynn on The Fighting Temptations, Jonathan's a brilliant comedy director, and he did My Cousin Vinny, and he did The Whole Nine Yards. He said to me when we started, he said, just keep in mind, first time funny. So if you laugh at it the first time, remember that, because you'll never laugh at it again.
That's interesting.
So you can't give up on something because it doesn't make you laugh anymore. You have to remember your reaction to it at the time. So I think that may be in line with what you were talking about.
That's very interesting. Well, I'm going to challenge you on something you just said, which is that the tool does not, you know, the pen does not make the writer. Because one of the stories in the book, and there's a reason for it, but I want to hear you talk about it, is you were forced, budgetary-wise, on Star Wars to cut on a moviola.
Yes.
And said that after a very short amount of time, you were like, I can't cut on this moviola. I need to be on one of the chems, or I need to be on a Steenbeck.
Yeah.
So there's the...
Well, that's just my inability. I mean, it's like, you know, if you said you have to use a typewriter, well, I don't know how to type. I want to write in longhand, you know, because I don't know how to type. It was sort of like that, you know.
Oh, it's the mechanical repetition of muscle memory was the problem.
Yeah, I hadn't done it in years. I hadn't worked on a moviola in years, and I'd forgotten. In fact, I never really apprenticed or assisted any feature editors. I was an assistant editor at a trailer house for a very brief time, maybe a year, something like that. And, you know, I didn't learn anything about organizing a feature film, all the things that, you know, that I didn't know you had to know. I thought I knew, but I didn't know, you know. Yeah, I had worked on a moviola then. You know, working a feature in a trailer house, you're working with feature films. So they're on big reels, and you have to work, you know, I don't think Steenbecks had come in quite yet when I was working there. So I had some familiarity with moviolas. I had cut my trailers on them. And once I moved over to the flatbeds, I was sold on that. And then I'd been working on flatbeds for several years by that point. Sisters, Phantom of the Paradise, Obsession, Carrie, I'd all done on flatbeds. So then at that point to go back to moviolas, I was all thumbs. I couldn't, you know, and I hadn't learned the techniques that moviola editors had learned from guys they had worked for. I didn't know any of that stuff. So I was just miserable, and I pleaded to get on a flatbed, and Marcia Lucas, you know, she saved me. She said, well, I'll work on a moviola. And she said, I prefer that. And I don't know if she meant it or if she was just being kind, but I jumped at it.
One of the things that I love about your book is you talk about your learning experiences, which I think is fantastic, that you can remember the genesis of something that you learned from someone. And a couple of the things you learned from Bernard Herrmann.
Yes.
One of them is the power of no score, which I think is a pretty outstanding thing to learn from a composer. I don't remember what the exact story was.
Sisters.
But on Sisters, he just said, no score, not here, no. Talk to me about that.
These are conjoined twins who've been separated, and there's a murder that takes place, and the doctor suspects that the conjoined twin who presumably died when they were separated, has now inhabited the body of the surviving twin. So there's a scene where he's talking her through, trying to get her to remember the murder. And he's brandishing the murder weapon at her, and he's talking her through the memory. And while this is going on, there are shots of her hand coming down, and close shots of her hand reaching for and grabbing a scalpel on a table next to where they're standing. And I was intercutting the doctor's face, Danielle's face, the hand, doctor, hand, face, you know, I was building tension, intercutting these angles. And I had imagined that the music would reflect that. So when we were spotting the scene, I'd say, yeah, so you start the music here, no, no. And I'd keep it here, no, no, no. And he waited and waited, and then what I conceived as the climax of the scene, when she cuts him, is where he began the music, which was a complete surprise to me. And I realized it was exactly what he had done in North by Northwest in the crop dusting scene. Because everybody remembers, oh, that scene had a great score. There is no score. It's all silent until the plane hits the fuel truck and there's an explosion. That's where the music begins.
Editors have to have a thick skin. You know, we take a lot of, we get a lot of notes, we get a lot of complaints, but we also have to be very empathetic. So how does that work? That you have to be so open to your emotions, and yet you have to have a thick skin?
It doesn't. No,
Do I need to find a new business? Do I need to find a new job?
Well, you know, it's difficult because we're so invested in our work. We're so intimately tied to the film. There's a real feeling of authorship because all these things are handmade. They're all handmade. Nobody else chooses what frame to go in on and what frame to go out on. You know, they'll be changed later, but you have to make those decisions in the first place. So by making all these choices, it really feels like, in your sense, you're an author of the film. To be fair, in a certain sense, you are. Film is very hierarchical. It has to be. It's a complicated artistic collaboration with many different contributors, and there has to be somebody who can make decisions. Everyone else is in a position of making suggestions, but there's only one person who's empowered to make decisions, and that's the director. So it's a subordinate, you know, editing is a subordinate position, and you have to satisfy yourself with having an influence on the film as opposed to control of it.
You mentioned on one film, Phantom, that you went on location for the film, but there are other films that you almost avoided going on location. What's the advantage of being on location for an editor and for the director?
I think that, in a way, it's an advantage not to be around the set because to have a truly objective editorial perspective, you need to be reacting to only what's on the screen and not the caterer was late that day and, you know, or so-and-so blew up and trashed their trailer, or the AD, you know, tripped and broke his ankle or whatever, you know.
Or a 400-foot tracking shot that took 3 days to lay the dolly shot, the dolly track.
Those things don't matter to the audience, and so for the editor rather, to have exposure only to what's on the screen makes the most sense to me. On the other hand, it's fun to be around the set because you get to talk to the actors and you get to tell stories, and, you know, and that was sort of the genesis of the book. I'd been on the set of Mission to Mars, and I was telling stories, and my wife wasn't with me on location in Vancouver at that time, and on the weekends I was alone, and I thought I should really write these stories down because I was getting some good reactions to them.
I bet you were.
And I thought I should really write these down because I might forget them someday. So that's how the book started.
I love it. Well, so often editors, we think of ourselves, I think, as storytellers, right? And your book is truly great storytelling.
Well, thank you.
I really, the stories are fantastic.
Thank you.
And one of the things I liked about the book actually is the structure, because it's not just chronological, would have been easy, right? But chapter 1 is Carrie.
Yeah.
And you leave the end of chapter 1 that you're running off to the airport or something. I think that's the way it works.
To go work on Star Wars.
Yeah, to go work on Star Wars. And then there's chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. And on chapter 8, what happens? How does chapter 8 start? Getting to the airport, right?
Yeah.
So tell me about the importance of structure. Like, why does the structure of that make it a great story? Why did that help the book?
Well, it's a standard technique. It's not anything I invented, The idea is hook people's interest and then step back and fill in. I knew that people were going to buy the book to read about Star Wars. That was going to be the most interesting film for them. And I didn't want to save it to the end of the book. That didn't make sense. I mean, my idea, when I started out, I thought, as you did, writing a book in chronological order would be kind of boring. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to do that. So then I think I started with the chapter on I Love Trouble. And as I started writing other chapters, I found myself saying, I had met him earlier when I was sort of trying to backfill and explain how the relationship had developed, and it was getting too complicated. And I thought to myself, well, I'll just write it chronologically, and it's just simpler that way. So that way, people will be able to follow who everyone is and how I met them and how the relationship grew and so forth. I was actually prompted to do this trick of the flashback by my book editor and my agent. They thought I should lead with something stronger.
What lesson does it hold for an editor to understand structure like that? Because your stories are, that's a macro chapter 1 to chapter 8 thing, but even inside of the story, you know how to tell a story as a storyteller. How does that translate to the screen? What are some places where you restructured a movie from the script, and it was because you are a storyteller?
The thing about telling stories is that you dole out information in a particular order, and as a storyteller, you're always divulging information and holding back information. And how you do that and when you do that is extremely important, and that, I would say, therein lies the art,
You gave me a piece of advice once, which was use each angle only once, because it gives the impression that that angle was designed for that purpose.
Exactly. If you have 6 angles on a 1-minute scene, you try to use each angle only once, it'll give each time you cut to it greater power, more freshness if you haven't seen it before. And it won't feel like the editor is manipulating the scene. It'll look like it was by design, even though it may not have been.
It's a harder way to edit, which is good. It's our job, right, to do what's right for the picture, not what's easy. But then, of course, you have to be very cognizant of where you are at certain points. Like, not only do you want to use every angle once, you have to say, where's the best point to use the close-up on Steve?
Right. So I compare this to crossing a stream on rocks, where you're out there and you get to the 4th rock and you realize you should have started on your right foot instead of your left foot. So you have to unwind everything you did so that you can get to where you want to get more easily.
One of the things that editors love to talk about is pace. And so often the discussion of pace is fast, like, boom, 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 that's pacing, right? But pacing is letting things land so people can feel them, right? Can you talk to me a little bit about like a slower pace or a pace where you feel something because you have enough time to think about it and feel it?
I like to say that I learned more about film editing from Beethoven than from anyone else. Because if you listen to a symphony, what you're talking about is an artist in control of time and how, at what pace he delivers the details of that make up his work of art, the chord progressions, how fast they succeed each other. There are movements, there's a fast movement, a slow movement, so forth. But you can learn more about structuring big chunks of time from classical music. It helps you to understand that when you're watching a movie, it doesn't have to all go at the same pace. There are times when you need to slow down, especially if you want to feel something. Scenes that involve emotion, you need to slow down so you can feel it. If there's an action scene, you need to go fast so that you keep the ball in the air, you know. Pace is not necessarily going faster. Many times it is, but you also have to know when to slow down.
In some of the films that you've doctored, like what are some of the lessons that I could learn from the mistakes that you have to go in and fix?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, when I saw Star Wars, it was really a puzzle because the editor who did the first cut is a very good editor. And some of the scenes were overcut. They were cutty and choppy, and the cuts were not graceful. And other scenes were too slow, and he hadn't used all the coverage. And so some were undercut, some were overcut. There was no consistent point of view, it seemed. I'm not really sure what happened there. I mean, what I know happened is he got fired at the end of the first cut, but no, it's hard to know. I worked on one film where I was brought in 2 weeks before the final mix. This is on film. I said, well, listen, there's not much I can do in 2 weeks. There's 10 reels.
I was going to say 10 reels, 10 days.
That's it, exactly. So I said, okay, give me all the stuff you cut out. I want to see all the stuff you've cut out. So the first reel, they showed me what they'd cut out was exposition explaining the whole film. I said, well, why did you cut this out? They said, well, it's exposition. As if that's boring, you know? I said, well, it may be boring to you, you know the story, but it's not boring to the audience. They need to know this stuff. Mm-hmm. So I put that back, and that was 90% of the fix. I mean, was putting back the thing they cut out.
Because that allowed the audience to understand and care about the rest of the picture, and therefore they're engaged.
Why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Do you think your approach has changed from when you were cutting on flatbeds to when you cut on NLEs? When you go in the morning and you get a bin full of dailies on your Avid or whatever NLE you're using, what's your approach and how has it changed from flatbed?
Yeah, I have habits of the way I work, and I like to keep track of all the angles that are available for a scene, whether I've used it or not. If I see that I haven't used it, I look at it, why didn't I use it? I try to use every angle. I figure if the director shot it, there must be a reason. Although that was before I started working with directors who shot everything in sight and had no idea what it would be used for.
You mentioned in the book almost a dressing down. I think it was Vittorio Storaro, where you were at a dinner and said, "What's your editing style?" You remember the story?
I think what he said was, "Do you have a style?" And I said, "Well, I don't think I don't think I should have a style. I mean, every picture has different demands, and I should cut the picture according to the different demands of the picture." He says, "Well, if you have no style, if you have no style, you're not really an editor," or something along those lines. And I think in a way he was right. I mean, I was right and he was right. You should cut the picture according to the needs of the material. But on the other hand, I think every editor has a particular outlook and way of reacting to stuff that is specifically and intrinsically her own.
Was Star Wars the first film that you had done with multiple editors?
Yes.
How did that relationship happen? You talked a little bit about how generous Marcia was.
Yes.
How did you guys collaborate?
Well, we divided up the work is what we did. I mean, Marcia was tasked with putting together the end battle. The studio wanted to cut the end battle. They wanted to cut it out of the movie.
It's crazy.
They saved the princess. They go to the Death Star. They save the princess. The movie's over. You don't need the end battle.
You don't need the Death Star blowing up.
So George was determined to have the end battle in the film. So he wanted to get it into production at ILM first, before anything else, so that if they started cutting back,
They'd be cutting back. They'd be cutting the tail of their
cutting
nose.
back at the end, they couldn't be cutting the battle. So Marcia came from England with George. Richard was hired in San Anselmo, and he started recutting the film, the cut that the English editor had made that they were unhappy with, and Marcia jumped into the end battle, and she had to piece together the battle from close-ups of the pilots in the various cockpits, front angles, side angles, and the people back in the control room with Princess Leia and 3PO, and then for exteriors, she was using, it's well known, this story,
World War II
aerial footage from World War II vintage movies. So she was busy doing the end battle, and Richard was recutting the film, and they could see that they weren't going to get finished in time, so they needed another editor. So that's when I was brought in. So Richard and I were recutting the film while Marcia was working on the end battle. And at a certain point, ILM had to have the cut of the end battle. So George pulled me off recutting the rest of the film and broke the end battle into two sequences, two halves. I don't think they were equal in length. I think Marcia had the longer half, but I had the longer half is an oxymoron, but you know what I mean.
I do.
And I had the latter part, the final Luke's trench run. So I worked on that. She worked on the first part of the battle, and then, days before it had to be delivered, we joined the two sequences, and the three of us, George, Marcia, and I, cut the final version. Doing a tag team. Marcia would sit at the controls for a while, and I'd sit on the couch with George, and then we'd change places, and I would drive, and she would sit on the couch with George, and we did that for a couple of days, and we locked the sequence, and then I went back to recutting the reels, and Richard and all of us were. So we were not working on the same scenes.
I know you didn't work on the same scenes, but did you comment on each other's work?
Yeah. So we had agreed that because all of our names are going to be in the picture, we didn't want to, if we had a problem with another editor's scene, we would accommodate that. We would accommodate anybody's differences before we showed it to George. So we would show our scenes to each other and then present it to George when we had his attention.
You've worked with some very big, very powerful, excellent directors, and I would think a lot of that is a certain amount of political savvy on your part in addition to your skill. Can you talk about being patient in, you talk about some of those suggestions you make to directors. Do you have to find the right moment to make a suggestion?
I'm not very strategic.
Maybe I need to ask this of somebody else. Hold on.
I've never been very strategic, and this is going to make you laugh, but when I read over when I was going over the book, I started to notice that a lot of my relationships with directors ended in some kind of unhappiness on their part. And I thought, well, maybe there's a pattern here. But I always felt in challenging directors, I was doing them a favor, that at least they would go into the world knowing that their ideas had been challenged and successfully tested. So they would feel more confident in what they were presenting, because they had withstood rigorous opposition of some kind, you know. But I guess, you know, after a while, I guess you get to be a pain in the butt. But like I say, I've never been really strategic, and I just always say what I think, you know. I think people call that opinionated, and, you know, I suppose I am. I don't know. I have my opinions, and I express them because I'm fortified by the knowledge that I have no power. So what's the problem with my expressing my opinion, since I have no power to enforce it?
Right.
I just say what I think, and, you know, it's up to you to decide.
I am really interested in the idea of when inspiration strikes. Like, how does that happen? You know, that moment when you're waking up, or that your brain is churning when you're not in front of your editing system.
Yeah, well, your brain is never really off. You know, you go to sleep thinking about the film, and you wake up thinking about the film, and it has a way of getting inside you, and then, you know, even when you're not thinking about it, it's some part of your brain is thinking about it. Yeah, I don't know. I've heard from other editors that they get ideas in the shower too. Maybe it's the physical stimulation of the scalp or something, you know.
No, I've had numerous ideas in the shower, editing ideas in the shower, and I just spoke to a documentary editor, Beuller, and she said the same thing. In the shower, I came up with this idea.
And you're relaxed, and you're comfortable, and your mind is just wandering, and you know, ideas pop up like seeds in the spring.
One of the things that I try to do is watch dailies and not cut anything. I'll watch dailies and then go home. At the end, after I finish cutting, it'll be the last thing I'll do. I'll watch dailies, and then that way they'll process while I'm sleeping and go in and cut the next day.
That's really interesting.
It works sometimes.
Okay, subconscious, here's a problem for you. I'll see you in the morning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was struck very emotionally by something you said. There was a scene in Steel Magnolias that you had to cut, and that you had a recent loss, and the director had a recent loss, and you guys couldn't bear to watch the footage, basically, other than your first cut.
Yeah.
Tell me about that emotional connection to a piece that affects you so deeply.
The scene you're talking about is the cemetery scene in Steel Magnolias, where Sally Field kind of loses it and in a rage about the injustice of someone so young dying before her. Losing a child is like the worst thing that could ever happen to somebody. And as you're watching, as an editor and watching dailies, you have to open yourself up and think, to make judgments about the material. You have to say, well, which is the most effective performance? Is this take making me cry, or is this take making me cry more? So you have to be crying as you're watching it, engaging the strength of your reactions, as to make judgments about the material. So in a situation like that, where there's so much grief on the screen, you're really opening yourself up to feeling those emotions, so that when the time comes when the audience is exposed to that material, they'll feel those emotions as well. So, but that scene was, you basically said that was the first cut and the last cut. Yeah, well, like I said, neither I nor Herbert wanted to go near it. It sat on my shelf for weeks. The material came in, I watched it, and I thought, Sally Field was so good in that scene that when they shot the reaction shots of the other women, of Shirley MacLaine and Olympia Dukakis and Dolly, and Sally's voice was only off screen. Her performance off screen was making me cry. She was so good. So I thought, well, I can't deal with this, so I put it away. I'll cut something else in the meantime, and then eventually I ran out of other scenes to cut, and I was faced with having to, it sat on the shelf like a radioactive package, and then finally I had to face it. I had to finish the film, so I finally faced it. I got through it, and okay, that's it. Didn't even rewind and watch. That's it. And then I cut it into the film. We showed it to Herbert, and he loved it, and he didn't want to go back into it either. So.
I have a very hard time believing this, so I need to hear it from your own mouth, even though I read it in the book, which is, I was shocked to read that the second Star Wars movie, which is now the, whatever, I can't keep up with the whole Star Wars. I just go by the way I watched them, which was the original
Empire Strikes
the
Back.
original Empire Strikes Back. You were locked a month after shooting ended?
Yes. Well,
How is that possible?
it's possible because the original schedule was 16 weeks and they shot for 29.
But you got, right, so it gives you a little bit more time during the shooting.
A lot more time.
But you have a lot more footage too, I would think, no?
No, the thing about that picture was the footage came in quite slowly because every shot involved, like on Hoth, every shot involved steam or something very difficult to control, like the steam or if there were not bullets, but
Laser
blasts on the wall. They had to have a little charge, and they do take one. Now you have where you had a white wall. Now there's a black mark where the thing exploded. So they have to, for take two, they have to put in a fresh one and then paint it over, and So if they did 2 or 3 setups by lunchtime, that was a lot,
So not so much footage, but gave you more time to
Yeah.
edit. That's
I'd go on the
incredible.
set after lunch, and they'd say, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I don't have any more film." And then
Give
I'd
me
say-
something to do.
And then I'd say, "What's taking so long?"
Which endeared you
Yeah,
even more.
Yeah, they love me. Crews don't like to see editors on the set. They figure if the editor's on the set, there's a problem.
Yeah. You won an Oscar for the first Star Wars film, but you were a bit surprised that the second Star Wars film did not, which I would be surprised too.
Wasn't nominated.
Wasn't nominated. For an editor, how do you judge editing? How do you judge a film that has been edited by you that you don't know what the dailies look like, you don't know what the director did? What strikes you?
Well, first of all, you're judging the editing, not the editor. So whoever is in charge, I mean, you don't know if it's the director's idea to do something or the editor's. That's not the point. But I judge whether a film is well edited by all the things I talked about before. Does it go too fast? Does it go too slow? Does it hold my interest? Do the moments land that should? Is it too long? And so forth. So if usually a good picture fits all those criteria. I mean, I think you can only judge. I told my wife, she asked me once, how do you tell if a picture's well edited? And I said, well, sometimes the biggest contribution I make is taking a scene out. And then all of a sudden everything works. So it's impossible to tell that sort of thing. The only thing you can tell is if the picture works. If it works, it's, holds your interest, it's entertaining, it's funny all the way through or whatever. If it works, it's well edited.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned cutting out entire scenes. I'm guessing that the scene that you cut out, whatever you're referencing, was a well-directed, well-cut, well-acted scene possibly, but it's breaking the story flow, or why would you cut out a good scene?
I became friends with James Hughes in the last couple of years. This is John's son, and he showed me some outtakes. Not outtakes, but some of the original cut of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And he showed me some scenes from the first motel that are hilarious. They're just hilarious. And it's just there just wasn't time to, I think in the first cut, that first motel scene ran 40 minutes.
Oh my
So
gosh.
you can't start a road movie with a 40-minute scene, as the second scene in the movie, So
The last time we talked, you told me about a scene that I've mentioned multiple people, the canary in the coal mine scene.
Yeah.
That is, you got to tell that just as a humorous story. So what got cut out of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles? Tell me that story.
Well, we were looking at dailies from the first motel scene, and it's the two guys are in bed, and the lights are out, and Candy's been annoying Steve with all sorts of clearing his sinuses, and he's smoking in bed and trying to read with a big
lighter.
lighter. And he's doing all this stuff, and then at one point he says, Steve, he says, Neil, do you know anything about coal mining?
No.
And he says, coal mining? What do you mean? He says, well, you know, coal miners like to keep a canary in a cage in the coal mine so that if there's, you know, a leak of toxic gas or something and the canary dies, then they'll know that there's a problem. He says, yeah. He says, well, imagine that we had a canary in a cage with us in bed under the covers. He says, yeah. He says, well, the canary just died. So,
how could you cut that out? How could you cut that out?
well, here's the thing about fart jokes. Fart jokes are easy laughs. Everybody laughs at a fart joke because, you know, obviously. But the thing is, the audience will hate you for it. You know, they'll laugh and then they'll feel, well, that was coarse.
You have had an amazing career that has spanned so many genres. Like, that was one of those things when I started looking, I'm like, there's horror, there's action, there's the most dramatic films, there's incredible comedies. So many editors I've talked to have complained about being pigeonholed.
Yeah.
How did that not happen to you?
I don't know. I got lucky, I guess. Yeah, you get typecast. It did happen to me, in fact. When I first came to Hollywood, I moved to LA just before Footloose. I'd been traveling around. I did pictures in London. I did pictures here. I did a picture here, rather, a picture in London, San Francisco. And once my daughter started being of school age, we thought, we can't keep bouncing around like this. So we thought, we'll move to one place where we figured LA was the place we could go where I would have to travel the least. And it turned out to be correct. But, so when I came to LA, first picture I did was Footloose. And then I did another picture with Herbert called Protocol. And then I did Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I went back to Herbert for Secret of My Success. And then I went back to John for Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. So I was doing all these comedies, one after the other. And apparently I was up for some picture, and they said, well, can you cut action, you know? And somebody said, well, you know, Star Wars had a little bit of action in it, you know? But so I don't know how, you know, people get typecast. And they also, it's reductive thinking to think that the editors can only do one thing. Although I will say this, to cut comedy, you have to have a sense of humor. And some people don't have a sense of humor.
True. You mentioned that Marcia Lucas has a broad stroke approach to editing. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but she liked to kind of put things in place, and edits would be harsh, and then she would go back and clean it up.
Yeah.
And your approach is very different.
Yeah.
Is there a validity to one or over the other, or is it just her psychology lets her work that way, and your psychology doesn't let you work that way?
Yeah, I'm a little too OCD to let something go that doesn't quite work. I have to get it to work, to leave it alone. Or she would just rough it out, and then she would have a process she called finessing the cuts, and I was like, what? What do you mean, finessing? I mean, because in my work, I finessed every cut before I went on, you know, so I didn't see it as a separate process. But, you know, what I learned was that you can be very successful working in a variety of ways.
Mr. Hirsch, thank you so much for joining us
welcome.
today, and I hope everybody gets a chance.
Thanks for inviting me.
Let me just show you this. This is my dog liked your book as much as I did, and it is a fantastic book. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a
Thanks for
pleasure.
inviting me.